All right, guys, so here we are in section 4.4, which is all about cellular respiration. So please make sure you title your section 4.4 cellular respiration. Now, this is the last new section that we're going to cover in chapter 4. I know we skipped 4.3. We're not going to stress about that because that goes into more detail about photosynthesis that we really don't need to know. Today we're going to touch on this new thing called cellular respiration. And then in our next PowerPoint, we're going to see a whole little overview and see how photosynthesis and cell respiration are connected. So our key concept, we've got the overall process of cellular respiration converts sugar into ATP using oxygen. Now this whole chapter, we've been talking about ATP. And if you remember, ATP is the chemical form of energy that all cells use. So remember, what kind of organism you are, if you're a plant or animal, you use ATP as a source of energy. In plants, if you remember in photosynthesis, plants make their own sugar. They make glucose. And that glucose then, or that sugar, gets turned into ATP using oxygen. And we're going to talk about this whole process. So our vocabulary, we've got cellular respiration, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, aerobic, anaerobic, fermentation, lactic acid. Our main idea, cellular respiration makes ATP by breaking down sugars. Cellular respiration is the opposite process of photosynthesis, and fermentation allows glycolysis to continue. Our essential questions, what are the products and reactants of cellular respiration? Just like we learned that photosynthesis is a chemical reaction, same thing here, cellular respiration or cell respiration is a chemical reaction. What happens during glycolysis? What happens during the Krebs cycle? And what happens during electron transport chain? And then lastly, how does fermentation allow glycolysis to continue? And there's a lot of words in here that are also our vocabulary words, so we're going to cover all these things. So basically, what is cellular respiration? Well, it's the release of chemical energy for use by cells. So once that energy that was in sunlight is changed into chemical energy by photosynthesis, an organism needs to transform the chemical energy into a form that can be used by that organism. So changing it into the usable form, or changing it into ATP, that is cellular respiration. So like I told you before when we talked about the key concept. So in photosynthesis, our plant turns carbon dioxide and water with the use of sun for energy into glucose, right, and oxygen. Then other organisms and even plants take in that oxygen, okay, and take in sugars, and the plant already has sugar, and they convert that into the usable form, into ATP. So this whole process is cellular respiration. So again, we have a chemical equation for cellular respiration, and you need to memorize this. Now, this is the opposite of photosynthesis, so it should be pretty easy. So if you can remember photosynthesis, just flip-flop the reactants and the products, and you have the equation for cellular respiration. So in this one, we have our glucose molecule, our sugar, plus our oxygen, are going to react to form carbon dioxide and water. When they do this, they also release energy in the form of ATP. Now, remember when we talked in photosynthesis, we talked about how that equation, the energy is actually being stored. It was stored in the glucose molecule. So when we've taken that glucose molecule, we break it apart, and it releases the energy from the bonds. If we're to describe cellular respiration, what we're going to talk about that is the breakdown of glucose molecules. This breakdown, we use a fancy word to describe the breakdown of glucose, and we call it glycolysis. Remember that root word when we talked about lysosomes, and lysosomes broke apart cell parts? I told you back in chapter 3 when we talked about cells, lyse meant to break apart. Well, if you see glycolysis, lyse is in there, and then glyco, which is glucose, is breaking apart that glucose molecule. So this is the part that actually releases energy in the form of ATP. And this takes place for cellular respiration in all living things, even plants, because they need to make ATP to use for energy. Now, this is also done in the mitochondria of the cell. And if you remember when we learned about organelles, we talked about the mitochondria was the powerhouse of the cell, where the energy for the cell came from. It comes because this is where ATP is made. So cell respiration occurs in the mitochondria of all cells and has two main cycles, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So in the Krebs cycle, it uses glycolysis, remember the breakdown of sugar, to make a small amount of ATP. This is also the part that releases carbon dioxide and it transfers more energy-carrying molecules to the next stage. Then we have the electron transport chain, which makes a large amount of ATP. It uses oxygen, and water is released as a waste product. So again, just like in photosynthesis where we had two stages, we had the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction. We have two little stages going on here too. One's the Krebs cycle and the other one's the electron transport chain. Okay? And the whole point of cell respiration is to make ATP, what cells use for energy. So oxygen and energy. Well, oxygen is required at the very end of cellular respiration. And as cells' demand for energy increases, the amount of oxygen it uses also increases. And you can think about this. So like if you're exercising super hard, what happens? You start to breathe heavier, right? Because your cells need more energy. They need more ATP, so they got to go through this process faster. Okay? So as a cell's demand for energy increases, the amount of oxygen it uses increases. Does that make a little bit more sense now? Now, the parts of cell respiration that require oxygen are called aerobic. That first part, A-E-R, that means air. Okay, aerobic, it requires oxygen. And now there's a part of cellular respiration that does not require oxygen, so we call it anaerobic. It means without air. So aero, without air. Now, we have this other thing called fermentation, and fermentation allows glycolysis to continue making ATP when we don't even have oxygen available. So it's an anaerobic process. So this is what happens when you're working out super hard and you're exercising at such a rate that your body can't keep up with producing ATP by using the oxygen you're taking in. So it has to switch on to this thing called fermentation, which allows glycolysis or the breakdown of sugar to continue, even when there's not enough oxygen. This happens also in different things where we ferment things. You've probably heard that thing before. We'll make like yogurt or cheese or bread. It ferments. So this is a process that breaks down sugars without oxygen. And sometimes when you exercise really hard or really heavy, you get this thing called lactic acid buildup, and that's what causes your muscles to cramp up after a really hard workout. All right. Actually, we're going to skip this slide because I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. So actually, we are going to leave it there. So guys, I just want to give you this overview again. Cellular respiration, those products and reactants are exactly opposite of those of photosynthesis. And we're going to talk about how this actually are more related in the next PowerPoint. But I want you to just see that exactly here, photosynthesis equation is exactly the opposite of our cellular respiration equation. All right, guys, and that's it. And I will see you in the next slides.